All right, I know we have a lot to talk about, so let's go ahead and get started. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Jurch, and I am the Associate Vice President of the Center for Policy and Practice at the Association of Community College Trustees. And I do want to say thank you for joining us for this discussion today. This is a topic that seems to be part of every conversation that I have had recently, and I'm sure you have had conversations about it as well, because it definitely can have a significant impact on your students. And so this webinar we're going to talk about today is a series that ACCT is hosting around Workforce Pell and how best to prepare from the institutional side. So we're bringing in a variety of different guests. We had one around data systems, and today we're going to be talking about Workforce Pell from the state's perspective. But before we get started, I want to take care of a couple of housekeeping items. So as you may have noticed, we are recording the session, and we'll send the recording out to the registrants as well as it will be posted on our website. And we have a few slides that will be sent out as well. But most of it will be a conversation between myself and our guests. I will be monitoring the Q&A function or the chat function. So if you would like to ask a question, please use that. We will have some time at the end to take some questions. So we'll go ahead and get into it. So today I mentioned we are going to be talking about Workforce Pell from the perspective of the governor's offices and also the state higher education officers. So I'm very excited to be joined by two key leaders and friends of mine in this space who are going to share information about how they are approaching this and what advice they have for institutions. And then after we hear from our guests, we're going to talk a little bit about some initial steps some institutions can take. Amanda Winters is one of our guests, and she is the Program Director for Post-Secondary Education in the Center for Best Practices at the National Governors Association. And Corey Gheesling is a Associate Vice President at the State Higher Education Executive Officers Association, better known as SHEEO, where he focuses on workforce and economic development. But before we get started, I do want to take just a second. There's been a lot of questions, and I know this conversation is happening rapidly and frequently, but I do think it is a benefit to kind of talk a little bit about what Workforce Pell, what the legislation actually says. And so what I want to do is give a little bit of background on Workforce Pell. So Workforce Pell is part of the OB3 bill that was signed into law in July of 2025. And what it sort of lays out a variety of elements legislatively that are going to be interpreted in the negotiated rulemaking, which is coming up next month, actually. And so, but I want to give you some highlights. And so it defines eligible institutions as Title IV eligible higher education institutions, both public, private, and not-for-profit. And one of the questions we get a lot is around program eligibility. And so essentially, the length of the program has to be between 150 and 599 clock hours and be between 8 and 15 weeks long. The credits or the credential must lead to a recognized, portable, and stackable credential. Programs must provide credit applicable towards higher level certificates or degrees unless it's in fields with only one recognized credential. One of the examples of that would be commercial driver's license, right? That is a terminal, quote unquote, terminal certificate. So the other piece is workforce alignment. So it must prepare students for high skill, high wage, or in-demand industries certified by state workforce boards. The one interesting piece is that it must have operated for at least 1 year prior to Pell, or 1 year prior before it becomes Pell eligible. And also, they did include distance education is eligible if all the other requirements are met. Now, some of these might, there's some nuance to some of these, and I think some that will hopefully be defined once the rulemaking occurs. So some more information. So program performance, this is where I think a lot of the questions lie around, which programs are going to be eligible. So one of the things they put in place was a completion rate of greater than 70% within 150 of normal program time, along with job placement at a greater than 70% rate within 180 days of completion. Now, there's an earnings test, which I did a little bit of an example here to kind of help people understand what that actually means. And basically, they're just trying to define a return on investment, right? So the median value added earnings 1 year after students complete has to be greater. It has to be greater than the cost of the tuition and fees when you also factor in the federal poverty line. So basically, if you look at the formula, that if you have an example would be if you had a median earnings of $33,870, 100%, 150% of the federal poverty line is $21,870. And the cost of the tuition and fees for the program was $10,000. If you do the math, so you take 33,000 minus 21,000, gives you $12,000 is the value added earnings. So the tuition and fee was only $10,000, so 12,000 is greater than 10,000. So that program meets that standard. So that is something, and we'll talk a little bit about what institutions can do, and we'll mention that coming up here. So the other thing is eligible students. They have to meet the same requirements as standard Pell, so income-based FAFSA requirements. They cannot use Workforce Pell concurrently with a standard Pell, but you can leverage both. So you can take a full Pell eligible program, and then if you complete that, you can then, or stop out of that for whatever reason, you can also then leverage Workforce Pell, but you cannot do them at the same time. And the Workforce Pell does count against the 12-semester Pell lifetime limit. One unique piece is you can actually have a bachelor's degree, but not a graduate level degree to leverage Workforce Pell. So those are some really top line stuff. I know there's a lot to be discussed just around that piece, but we want to make sure that we have time to talk a little bit about what states are doing. So just to give you a little bit of an implementation timeline. So we mentioned that negotiated rulemaking will take place starting in December. And so December, January, they're going to talk about definitions, accountability, so on and so forth. Now, July 1 is when the provisions are supposed to take effect. And there's some anxiety that's been created around that deadline. We'll talk a little bit about maybe some perspectives on from the state and also from the institution side around what that actually means and how we should approach that. So first, we want to turn to Amanda, and we want to talk about the governor's role, because they were specifically named in the legislation, right? So Amanda, so I mentioned that the governor's offices were specifically named in the legislation as the lead entity. So what are some of the processes that will need to be developed and implemented?
Yeah, so glad to join everyone today. Thanks for the opportunity to come and have this conversation. Certainly, this has been something that's high on our minds throughout the large HR1 or One Big Beautiful Bill, whatever we're calling it. There were only a handful of places, I think 4 total, where governors were called out in their role specifically. And this was a space where they've been given a lot of authority to set up processes and implement program eligibility processes and data collection within their states. So we are excited to bring folks together to figure out what that looks like. Certainly, every state is going to have a slightly different approach, as we know, because, federalism. So I want to just drop in quickly to give you guys some context into the chat, just an announcement about some work that we're rolling out, and ACCT is going to be a strong advisory voice as a part of this project, and SHEEO is partnering directly with us on this work. We have 30 states and territories as of yesterday who are coming alongside to have a peer learning network around this effort, because governor's offices, this is a very new space for them, thinking about program eligibility. And all these ROI conversations and the data and outcomes conversations connects with a lot of governors' priorities, but they have not really had the opportunity to be this directly connected to the oversight processes and what that looks like. ever before. So this is sort of a new space, and we think it's very exciting about how we can connect education workforce priorities directly to what it means to be a high quality non-degree credential. So we are going to be partnering with states to think about a couple things initially. So we reached out to governors and said, who's going to be your lead on Workforce Pell? As Steve already mentioned, this work is a cross agency. It's unavoidable that several agencies or entities within states are going to be highly invested in what this process looks like and what the outcomes are. So, and where the data lives right now or doesn't live, but needs to in the future. So, we're engaging with all states where they are right now. And whatever that looks like. Initially, some of the conversations we're going to have, first one will be governance. How do you want to govern this process for program eligibility and oversight? We know from having talked to quite a few states that, the majority of these programs we know will live at their community or technical college level, especially how the bill is written right now. Certainly, the devil's going to be in the details when it comes to negotiated rulemaking as to how many programs might be eligible, given the wiggle room that they allow around like credit to non-credit, some of the definitions around stackability, et cetera. So I'm very interested to see how that plays out so that there's a better understanding of program eligibility. But as the bill is written now, it's relatively narrow, and quite a few states are seeing a small amount of programs that are initially eligible. So really focused on some of that data, but also how a governor wants to speak across education, workforce, institutions, data collection, et cetera. And then also connect over to employers to have those metrics around employer validation of the programs that they're putting forward as being Workforce Pell eligible. So governance will be a first sort of conversation. How are you guys going to govern this process? Many states have some ongoing conversations around non-degree credential quality, which I know many of the folks on these calls have probably been a part of. We're fully expecting that governors will leverage some of these existing conversations in order to support that ongoing effort. But this will be sort of an arranged marriage in many states, between their workforce and higher education conversations, which will be easier in some states, but it's not necessarily very organic in others. So we're here alongside to sort of help governor's offices think about what that looks like. Now, another thing to keep in mind for us, and certainly will be a challenge, but something we're thinking about from the beginning of our work is we have, I believe, 36 governors up for election or re-election next year. And this is right after the processes are all put in place for the July 1 effective date. So that fall, we will be getting an influx of new governors. So we're very interested to see sustainability of process and continuity across leadership change for these very new conversations around eligibility of these programs. So just a few flags that we're putting out there about some of those spaces and some of the things from a governor's office perspective that very early on are on our radar, is thinking about the governance of the overall process, sustainability across leadership change, and then really zeroing in on what programs are currently eligible and what we'd like to see in the future around either developing our programs or thinking about flexibility within the federal approach.
No, thanks. And I'm glad you pointed out that this is, there's a lot of moving parts. And I think this is one of the things that I've sort of heard along the way is I don't want to call it a forced collaboration, but it is a massive collaboration across agencies within the state. And I think, sometimes things work well and sometimes things don't. So, there's going to be multiple agencies involved in a lot of these various processes. So have you heard, are you seeing any sort of trends, or has there been any discussion around recommendations about which entity should be the primary decision maker, or is it going to be totally random to whim, so to speak?
Well, certainly, NGA isn't one to tell a governor's office how to govern those processes. But I will say what we did in our outreach for our project, which I mentioned has 30 states and territories. So we have a pretty good cross section of over half the country about how they're approaching it. So they put together their teams. We reached out to the governor's office and we said, you tell us who your lead is for this. And yesterday we did the kickoff for those states and territories. And we did, first of all, we looked at the names that were submitted to us. And then we did a little bit of a poll, like who's on this call? What role do you hold? I will say over 50% of the leads are higher education voices.
Hmm.
But then you have probably a solid third that are workforce in the workforce agency or in a state workforce role. And then you have others that are advisors from the governor's office, so sit outside of an agency role and instead sit in the executive space. So we had a pretty good cross section, but there was a really heavy representation from higher education. Certainly, higher education has the history of these types of mechanisms in the past, program approval, provider approval, data collection around completion, et cetera. So there will definitely be a very strong through line there. But I think there are some states where the workforce entity is taking the lead in the state. And in some places, they have their higher education voices very closely alongside. And in others, it's sort of a group assembled by the governor's office. So that's kind of the cross section that we're seeing right now in the teams that are coming to our project.
That's actually I'm very pleased to hear that. I know that workforce and higher ed in the states typically have a strong relationship anyway, so I'm hoping that no matter who the lead is there, there's going to be some strong collaboration. Um, One of the things I talked about at the very beginning was the timeline, right? This is a July 1 um, theoretical implementation timeline. So, that's a pretty quick turnaround, particularly when you're talking about, moving a government entity along. So, do you have any thoughts or have you heard anything around how states are going to manage the rollout of this, given the fast implementation timeline? And also, they really can't, I mean, there's only certain things they can do until the rulemaking occurs, right? So their hands are tied for, until January. Fingers crossed, everything goes well. So, how do you anticipate them managing this?
Yeah, so the tight timeline is challenging. That's one of the things that's certainly as we saw it pass this spring was immediately apparent to us. Like, oh, we got to move fast to support states in doing this because the federal government and state government does not historically move quickly. And this is sort of like asking both of those entities to change the way in which they work in order to move this through really fast. Um, we have gotten no indication from the federal side that there will be any give on that implementation date. So we are fully planning for implementation as planned within the bill. I do think it's accelerating some of the conversations, which is perhaps not a bad thing in states where people are getting together. The entities are getting together at end of this year, early next year to strategize together. I think one thing that sort of, I mean, saves us a little bit in this early stage is that based on the bill language, a lot of programs are not eligible. And so the planning will be for eligibility in the future, or, what are we going to do to weave this into a larger post-secondary and workforce strategy in the state? And how are we going to think about data collection? We have gotten some indications from federal partners that they are very open to waivers or flexibility in these early stages of implementation around data collection, et cetera, knowing that some of those things are still sort of in a building stage or don't exist in some states. So I feel like we have some sort of implementation of flexibility from the federal side. And then also hopefully it will feel like almost like a pilot group of programs that are launching based on the bill eligibility that can then we can then think about like building the sector into the next couple of years to expand to appropriate programs being a part of the eligibility um, discussion here. So I feel like it's going to be a lot. We're going to be sort of hurtling towards that July 1 implementation date. But I think states are at least ready to start those conversations, get some of the processes going. And I am hopeful that this will spur some, connection of conversations we've been having for several years now around credentials, around data, around outcomes, around employer connections and workforce outcomes, bringing them together in one space. So, but it is going to feel kind of frantic, I think, when it comes to that implementation deadline.
Yeah, no, and I'm glad, to hear that around the flexibility. And, we're definitely appreciative of being included in that conversation. We've communicated to our membership, we want to or try to message to as many people as possible that July 1 is a start date, not a deadline, right? And I think, it shows that some of this flexibility that they're allowing, that if you don't have a program ready on July 1, that's okay, right? We want to make sure that Workforce Pell is communicated for the win that it is. I mean, it is, in my view, in my history at a community college, it is a impactful piece of legislation that our students are going to be able to, benefit from. So I want to encourage all of our members to, have the conversations now. And we'll get to some more strategies in a minute, but are there any states that are just sort of like taking some really strong initial steps towards implementation, or are they all sort of around that same sort of just, I won't say dipping their toe in the water, but just sort of like having these initial conversations, or are there some front runners?
I mean, we love all states equally, so they're all doing amazing things. But I will say from the applications, and we didn't require a rigorous application process to engage with us. Are essentially like, come together and let's learn together and do this because a lot's happening fast. We want to make sure states are set up for success. We've had some states that already have some really firm ideas that they've brought to us, so it's exciting to see. Certainly, we have folks like New Mexico that's working very closely across their higher education systems. So we're excited to see the sort of the connection of a lot of folks on their team. Rhode Island has a great, and they have a history of a really great education and workforce connection across their community college space. And their SHEEO office, super strong presence there. So super excited to have them here as well. We also have Maryland, who's been taking a lot of steps over the past year or two to really closely connect their education and workforce entities. So we see a lot of great early collaboration there. Some other states, like certainly Virginia, is in leadership change right now with the new governor coming on board. So it's very exciting to see some of the education folks take the lead on this conversation while the governor onboards, and being able to sort of set the new governor up for success in implementation of a new process. Seeing the same thing in New Jersey, of those agency folks and higher education entities taking the lead on saying we want our state to be ready. So we want to drive these conversations forward even during transition, which we know is super challenging. So we're very excited to see that. And then we, see some of these players who are not surprising to us, like Indiana, who has a history of really strong education and workforce connections. So we're excited to see them there. So we've been hearing from states about their approaches, and we're very excited to see how those play out. But in pretty much every team, we've seen a real good cross-section of agency engagement. So I think we'll see early in the year a couple models that probably emerge from some of these states that folks are excited to see and want to align with. And then hopefully mostly leveraging ongoing conversations and not siloing out a workforce Pell conversation separate from some of these great conversations that have been happening between community colleges and workforce, or have been happening between a SHEEO agency and the governor's office. So we're hoping to see those vehicles really emerge as sort of these cross-agency conversations should be the norm, and a quick response to implementation around this timeline is the benefit of maintaining those strong interagency relationships.
Definitely. And so, speaking of interagency relationships, I want to bring Corey to the conversation. And one of the things you mentioned is the involvement of higher ed. And one of our goals with the work that we're doing is, and participating with you in your project, is to make sure that the community college voice is at the table when these states are designing these processes, right? If traditionally the community college is going to be the end user, we want to make sure that we want to inform these states to make sure that what they're proposing and developing actually is going to work on the ground. And so that's another reason I'm glad to see a lot of the higher ed involvement as part of your project. And so I want to turn to Corey now. And so Corey, Amanda's talked about the role of the governor. She mentioned that there's a strong higher ed component at the state level. So it's which makes perfect sense. It's obvious that you should be part of these process development. But how do you see SHEEOs engaging? Like, what is your take? Like, what is the reverse side of that? What is your take on how SHEEOs are engaging with the governors to ensure that your constituents are included in that process?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Made a great framing as well about our joint work and what we're hearing. So it when Workforce PELL was passed, obviously the first thing we heard from our members, and if you're not familiar with SHEEO, we represent the lead higher education agency in every single state that comprise of membership. And so one of the things that we were hearing is, oh my gosh, we can't believe we were left out of the legislation, right? And that's for a variety of reasons, right? Whether a SHEEO office is a governing entity or a coordinating entity in the state, around the country, our members occupy critical spaces that are absolutely necessary for Workforce PELL to be implemented with fidelity and in alignment with the administration's goals around providing short-term education that leads to meaningful careers and economic mobility, right? But regardless, SHEEO is really bringing to bear a variety of policy, administrative, and evaluative assets that states are going to really have to leverage effectively in order to implement Workforce PELL, both in the immediate short term, but also in the long-term sustainability of it. A few of these that many of our members kind of are the lead entity in the state is one, just inventorying and approving new programs. And so whether that may happen, many states probably let the technical college board, community college boards do their own approval, but they do have to register them with the states. And so every state has an inventory of programs that are offered. Most of our members direct funding, both federally and at the state level. Many are, if they include their financial aid operations in the state, that they at a minimum have a very close working relationship with their financial aid agencies as well, and have a lot of expertise both in the rulemaking and the regulatory environment of the state, as well as just the monitoring of those funds. And they bring tremendous expertise there. And our members are typically who the data has to be reported up into iPads for. So our members have really robust data capacities, research and evaluative capacities as well. And so a lot of these programs will obviously be involved in those similar types of data reporting processes. And last, like most of our members are also engaged in a variety of different student success initiatives. More and more of them are being tied to economic and workforce development as a key catalyzer, in addition to just the frankly right thing to do for post-secondary students. And so with all that to say is our members have a tremendous amount of current expertise and ability to be involved in these conversations. And we are very grateful that the majority of states have centered their SHEEO member involved in these conversations, right? In either a leading capacity or a co-leading capacity. They are very active in this space. But, we do have a number of states that, when they go through the text and they see workforce agency or they see governor's office, like that is where they are locating that work. Now, that isn't to say that our members aren't going to be involved in this space, um, but it does say that the work to be done to make sure that these programs are as well thought out and well robust enough so that they can deliver effective education to a variety of individuals to the utmost ability, I think really requires an all hands on deck approach that states really need to have. And last, I would just add, SHEEOs are an interesting entity in of themselves because as we all look at our own state's higher education ecosystems, they comprise of R1 research institutions, community college systems, independent colleges, and then all the proprietary elements as well. And this is a space in regarding coordinating between all those entities for the betterment of post-secondary education that our members just bring a ton of knowledge and expertise, and we really feel like we're always better when we're working in an interagency approach with each other.
No, that's great to hear that, and that's an important because uh, SHEEO the SHEEOs are like one of those entities that we all know who they are, but we don't necessarily know all the minutia of what they do. And so I think that explanation was educational for me as well. But one of the things I want to sort of touch on is this early engagement. We talked about Amanda talked about um, we're trying to get out in front of this to get as much done before that deadline as possible. And I know that you guys are engaged directly with them in what I would consider an early phase. And I know there are states that have started work, as was mentioned before, way before we even, we sort of people were preparing for the bill to pass even before it did pass. So I think what are you telling your membership, not necessarily just 2 year, although this is the focus of today, but like other members of your organizations, what are you telling them when it comes to strategies around that early engagement?
Yeah, and so I think it's important that we can pull back. I know Amanda and I have had a number of conversations about this. It across the country over the last, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years, more states have been creating some type of interagency education and workforce development council task force, either through a governor's office or through statutory requirements. And so for a lot of our members, especially here on the call, we're encouraging membership to not duplicate effort, right? Like there may already be interagency data folks meeting that they're very likely that that is happening, right? There's probably already all sorts of relationships between industry councils in the post-secondary education space, so there's a lot of work that's probably already being done that we can just bring together for the purposes of effective workforce Pell. What we are specifically telling our membership, though, is that while rulemaking is set to begin in a couple weeks, and so we will know a lot more of the technical questions. I've seen a few of those questions in the chat, and I think the easy answer for all of us is like that's going to be determined during rulemaking. But there's a lot of work that states and institutions can already be doing right now to really put themselves on second or third base in these conversations. And so we have been advising our members to go ahead and, if there isn't already that interagency working group established, to go ahead and create that. Identify your project leads that will range across your workforce agency, governor's office, and the SHEEO member. And really, who are those key decision makers that really need to be in the room? Bring the institutional and system voice into that conversation as early as possible, because you really have to start working on aligning definitions of how your state is going to define high demand occupations. How are you going to go about employment outcomes? What are the other program success attributes that states want to have included as part of their eligibility requirements? And as Amanda mentioned, there's 50 states and all the different territories attached. We anticipate over 50 different approaches to how states are going to approve which programs will be eligible for Workforce Pell. Determining that programmatic eligibility is a really clutch initiative that these entities are going to have to do. But there's really a critical conversation that I think will be informed by rulemaking. But I think states can go ahead and have these cursory conversations: is how are we going to handle eligible training providers? for some of our states that lives within the post-secondary sector, and other states that lives within the workforce. We have three members that is one and the same. And so these are conversations that state by state, you're going to have some hard or, just tough but necessary conversations on how we want to make sure that we have effective delivery of these programs that are really accessible to learners across our states. Inventorying these programs that meet all the eligibility requirements are critical. As Amanda mentioned, I'm sure we'll talk about in a few minutes, just that we have a few states that have already really led the way in this and providing us some really great insight in what is the current state of play for these programs and meeting workforce eligibility. But I think the next step is identifying those that maybe meet some, but not all, right? Like which are the ones that could be scaled, and that you could, your state could participate in the FIPSI grant, right? To try to get some additional funds to scale some of these programs. The data infrastructure, I think, is probably one of the most complicated pieces here. And I want to give credit where credit's due as well. I know all of our organizations and many members of this call have probably been involved in a lot of P20 data conversations now, going back 10, 15 years. I think a lot of these questions are just rolling over some of those same work that we are already engaged on. But as we all know, in many of our institutions, the non-credit and credit data systems are separated, and neither of the two shall come together, right? And so this Workforce PEL is a really critical moment for our institutions, systems, and states to really, take down some of these barriers, identify the strengths, but also just the opportunities that states can invest in these spaces so that we have data systems that can really be effectively reporting how, what's actually happening with these programs and how are students moving through them, what's their success on the other side of it. And that's obviously going to take states' labor market information teams that are typically in their departments of labor. It's going to take the SHEEO member that's providing the programmatic outcomes, and then obviously the institutions to provide good, high quality and clean data, right? And so we anticipate this being a pretty significant area of work that, again, all we need is everybody to do well. And it's one thing that we're excited to work with folks. And last, you almost don't want to say it, but you better start bringing together your GCs, right? Your general counsels from across different agencies and your institutions, and really kind of go over some of the critical FERPA related items and different areas like that, as well as just your own state's rules and regulations processes regarding financial aid, because there's probably going to be a lot of work that needs to be done to retrofit existing policies to make sure that they're in alignment with whatever rulemaking determines in a few weeks here. And I think last is you can't get early enough on the strategic communications, right? And so working with those partners to really understand how can we best coordinate our messaging across the state to make sure all students are aware of this new opportunity, and it's a new pathway, right? And so how do we educate both institutions, advisors, students, employers about these pathways and what they mean for those individuals? And these are all things that we're going ahead and encouraging folks to bring people together, have these difficult conversations, but it's also about growing the circle of knowledge and your expertise in your own localities.
Yeah, I mean, there might be one or two things that we need to be thinking about,
Just a little bit.
Just a few things, but to that point, these are things that institutions and states are already doing, not necessarily in relation to Workforce PEL, but in relation to other things, right? There's always conversations around stackability, credentials of value, employer engagement, and their voice. And I think, one thing we've started to see is like, can we use Workforce PEL as a catalyst to finally make some of these, break down some of these silos, create some of these conversations and processes and reform, systemic changes that we've been talking about for a long time. And I think, all of the things you mentioned are already happening to some degree. It's like, how can we then use Workforce PEL to amplify the movement towards bringing that, to fruition? So, that's one of the things I'm excited about. And, I'll ask both of you this next question is, what should institutions do in relation to engage with either their state office or their SHEEO? So I guess we'll let Corey go first.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Steve. I would say that institutions, your voice really matters right now, right? So a lot of the massive, laying out the chessboard is happening at the state level. And if states are not already incorporating the voice of the institutions and systems that comprise their post-secondary sectors, they need to be. So really be you know, definitely don't want to be annoying, but definitely push, right? Like make sure you're in the room where these conversations are happening and can be adequately represented. I think, Steve, you mentioned it a second ago. I think really institutions can bring a lot of information, especially around the data piece right now. Like what are the current limitations that may exist in this conversation? What are some of the areas where I think the higher level policymakers, both at the state and federal level, might not be more aware, right? Like it's not lost on me that I know many institutions have been engaged in multi-year just change management processes to try to align their non-credit credit data information systems. I think we think that we can flip the light switch on July 1 and everything is going to be reportable. And then we just simply know that that's not true, right? And so I think having some realistic expectations at the state level can be best informed by institutions. But I think you're exactly right, Steve. Like these student success efforts that many of us have been pushing for the last 10 years, whether it's stackability or portability or prior learning assessments or credit for prior learning, whatever you want to call it, like this is a moment where a lot of these efforts can coalesce into a more substantive effort and investment, right? Both by the state and by institutions to really work on the administrative side to bring some efficiencies at scale to our institutions. So it's not just the three or four advocates that may exist on a current campus, but this is just the way that we are doing business from now on. And I think institutions can really do a lot to raise how that moment in time is here, but also identify those areas of state policy that are not in alignment with the current workforce Pell requirements. And we know that there's a lot. And I think one of the issues that I see right away is around transferability, or especially interstate transferability with how many of our institutions sit on borders. I think that these are really necessary areas where SHEEOs and others have to get in alignment with what the reality is on the ground, and institutions can provide that voice that needs to be heard.
It's a
Yeah, and I'll
great
just
perspective.
I'll just add to that, certainly from the governor's perspective. And I shared just shared a link in the chat from our colleagues over at National Skills Coalition, which is sort of a good overview of where some of these requirements and responsibilities live, especially in the state and federal, and these around data. And so I just want to share that with you. But I really think for us, it was really important for us to inform governors' offices about who should be at their tables as they're having these conversations in states. I will see a reflection as I look over our teams that we have assembled. There are a few states where the community college board or entity is the lead entity in the state. And so it's really great to see that. Certainly, my home state of Illinois, their community college board is the lead entity for the governor's office on this because they are historically the ones that are a required partner for WIOA. So they sit on the state workforce board. They have these relationships across higher education and workforce, and they sit at a really unique space for the governor. They're not the only state that has a really strong community college presence. But it's certainly one that I wanted to call out because of my love for the state of Illinois. But we're excited to see diverse tables set for governor's offices, a lot of the right kinds of voices. And I will just highlight as a part of our work, we're also bringing alongside us, other than SHEEO and ACCT, which are very clear partners for us, a couple other entities that are important, I think, for governor's offices to hear from. NASFA, so the financial aid administrators, are part of our outreach efforts, as well as Education Finance Council, which is sort of the association for those groups within your states that are doing FAFSA outreach to schools and to students. So those people who are on the ground helping with FAFSA completion. Super important to make sure that those folks are able to have a voice in some of these conversations, as well as to understand how implementation will impact the work that they're doing on the ground. So we think there's sort of this bridge between these initial higher level agency conversations and governance of program approval, but then also engaging the students, the people who are going to be moving through these processes. What does that look like to translate these agency level conversations and these big data connection conversations to the people who will be accessing these programs, who will be, getting enrolled and hopefully completing and thinking about stackability and messaging the pathways that are available with these new access points. And how are we going to do that? And so helping the governor to have a longer term view of not just what we need to do before July 1st, but what does it look like after July 1st? When you've got the people starting to come into programs, or outreach starting, or FAFSA completion happening for some of these programs that have not been eligible in the past. How are we going to manage those? And so I think for us, it's very important. Certainly, community colleges are a key voice here, but also some of those other voices that surround the students who will then be eligible for these new opportunities, and helping to set those tables correctly for governors' offices, so that they can have a full insight into not only initial implementation, but also longer term implementation and eligibility and access within their state.
No, the information that last piece that both of you said is just so important. And, I know there are a lot of questions that are yet to be answered because of the rulemaking, and some of the things we think are going to happen may not happen, right? Because of government, right? But I want to make sure we leave enough time. There has been a lot of activity in the chat and the Q&A, and I appreciate Amanda taking a stab at some of these while others are speaking. But I want to talk briefly about some things that institutions can be doing. I know some of the advice has already been given, and Amanda, I'm not sure if you and Corey can see the Q&A function as well. There's a couple of questions in there that you might want to take a stab at while I'm doing this. But anyway, so what can institutions do? So I think the biggest takeaway for me around all the conversations I'm having is, a lot can't happen until rulemaking occurs. So begin with what you already know and can control, right? Corey mentioned around, their states already have definitions around what high wage, high skill, high demand occupations are, right? Colleges already know which programs meet those requirements because that's sort of what they do anyway, right? So use those existing definitions as a guide, at least to start, to Corey's point earlier, to start identifying those programs that might meet all of these requirements as written in the legislation. They may need to be tweaked once rulemaking occurs, but at least it's a good place to start. And start looking at the wage premium of your potential programs, right? I know that there are, depending on what side of the college it lands on, there's different ways to price programs. So you need to make sure that it falls within that return on investment metric. Look at credential stackability and portability. There's a lot of work that a lot of institutions have to do around the non-credit to credit, around stackability, around awarding, credit for prior learning. I think start by taking an inventory of what's happening at your institution and what processes that you might need to, address before being able to leverage Workforce PELL. Again, that's what this July, we're approaching the July 1 as a start date, not a deadline. And then I think one of the, my experience at the institution, was around a lot of the completion placement information, right? That's going to take some data information to be able to look at job placement. Hopefully you're tracking your completion rates if it's a workforce non-degree program. But those are some potential barriers that I think institutions are going to run into. And what other student supports are you going to need to implement to help those students get to that 70% completion? And what type of engagement activities are you going to need to do to get to that 70% job placement rate. So those are just some sort of low-hanging fruit, to use that phrase, to take a look at now, and then build on, as we learn more. So I want to take a few minutes to see what kind of questions we have before we sign off. But it's like there's some questions. Okay, so
Can I
were
pop
you
in with
able?
it? Just a few. I've
Yeah,
answered a
sure.
few in the chat, and then certainly there's one in the Q&A. The chat and the Q&A, I was like, pew, 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 pew.
I
All
know.
these questions coming in. It was great. Um, so a great question was thrown into the Q&A about sort of the roles of states and the feds. Again, I think the outlines of these will be solidified during negotiated rulemaking, but from the bill, certainly we're seeing a few things that are very specific to states. States can apply their own requirements above and beyond at least this is what we've heard from the Fed so far, above and beyond the requirements of the bill. So if there are some additional quality measures or outcomes or things that states want to see in governors' offices or seeing as a priority, those can be layered on top of the foundational bill requirements. Also, we will be seeing, hopefully, definitions around stackability and portability come out of the negotiated rulemaking so that it isn't 55 states and territories saying this is what we think stackability means. Because really, honestly, everybody, we could, if we wanted to put anything on a pathway, we could, at least on paper. So I think that's sort of, we need to figure out what are the mechanics of actually saying, we know this is stackable. And then are we going to start tracking people through some of these pathways in ways that we haven't in the past? Interesting to see what will happen with data acceleration connected to some of these programs as this gets implemented. Also, another thing that was brought out in our early conversations with states and our kickoff call yesterday is employer demand. Like, how do we align with something that we're going to define as an in-demand or employer aligned credential? And so I think states want to dive a little bit more deeply into that. Some states have already, defined some things based on labor market data, et cetera. But I think they want to dive a bit more deeply into what credentials do what value as a part of some of those pathways. So I think that will play pretty strongly into what the state's role is going to be, what credentials are actually getting those completers to that economic outcome after completion and that employment placement. Um, and then, so some of the data stuff's a little bit squishier. Some of the one of the questions in the Q&A was around who's going to be pulling what data and connecting what data. Those are some real challenges. So the meshing of federal data with state-specific data, because there's not necessarily a lot of clear connections there. A lot of states have unique identifiers, and so meshing that student-specific data can be very challenging into the future, and then thinking about wage record data, et cetera. So I think we're going to see hopefully some outlines emerge with the negotiated rulemaking about what the feds will actually commit to doing in the way of data and what will be left up to states, and then how the states will or the feds will deem whether or not the state data is sufficient for the requirements of the bill when it is submitted. So those are a few things that we're waiting to see play out. But certainly, I would also throw people back over to that National Skills Coalition, a little like 2 or 3 pager that I shared has a pretty nice outline of a few of the ways in which some of these roles are differentiated. So if you want a quick sort of just a referral piece, that one is very useful.
Thanks. Sorry, I was just checking a message or a question actually. And so just some additional housekeeping. Yes, I will share the link to the previous webinar as well around data. When I send out this information, I'll definitely send the slide deck, and I will check on how to share the questions and answers if we were able to answer them in the chat versus live. Obviously, you can watch the recording if it was live, but yes, we will try to do our best to answer those if we haven't, and then provide some context for everyone. Are there any other questions? Oh, is this one? Let's see. Oh, here's a question. Are OJT hours counted as training? Anybody want to tackle that one? I
I
think
don't
that
think
depends on
so.
how they, yeah,
Yeah, right now I don't think so. There was another question that came up in the chat around also around apprenticeship
right.
models. I think some of those things are high priorities for this administration. So I think there's going to be a tendency to give a lot of flexibility, but as the bill is written right now, I think we have some real limitations on how sort of innovative we can be and what we're going to allow to fall under this. But certainly, Corey would welcome your thoughts here too.
Yeah, I think the Title IV limitation in the text really kind of stalls some of the questions around OJTs, but that's not to say that there shouldn't be partnerships, right? And I think a lot of Workforce PELL is just going to expedite, like, what does it look like for your industry partners in your respective context to partner with your programming to make sure that these things are one and the same, right? Because I think at the core of when you look at this administration's America's Talent Strategy, it really does push the ball forward on the notion of lifelong universal learning, where the barrier between on-the-job training and professional development in the workplace and what we see happening in our post-secondary sectors is just a lot more transparent and open, and that people should be able to move back and forth in a lot more seamless manner. And so I think that these kinds of questions are the right kinds of questions to have, but also I think can spur some really creative approaches that we're going to be seeing. And a lot of this, and Steve and I have had this conversation, like you probably have institutions in your states that are already doing incredibly innovative things in this space. I know Thomas Edison State in New Jersey is really active in having robust credit for prior learning for journeymen and union mechanics, right? And to offer associate degrees. And so, these are really great opportunities to elevate some of the work that we see that are already happening and be able to scale those best practices.
Awesome. Well, I hope everyone on the call recognizes why I had these two amazing people on with me because they obviously are extremely knowledgeable, and I hope that everyone has learned as much as I actually have. And so I just want to thank our guests, Amanda and Corey, for taking time out of their busy schedules to, talk with us and give some perspective from, the state, the governor's office and the state higher education perspective. And hopefully you can use this information to, further the work that you're doing at the institutions. And finally, I have a slide up with our contact information. If anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to us. I think we did a pretty good job of answering all the questions, but if you have additional ones, please feel free to reach out. And so I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their day. And thanks for spending some time with us.
Thanks all.